fun and interesting. And we love the fact that people are coming in from all over the world at different times of day. Some people identify where they are by the time zone only. We are, I will make a couple of really quick announcements and then we'll get started. First of all, we strongly, for those of you who may not always be with us, we really encourage you, especially during discussion and beginning and end, to have your camera on so that we can say hi. I would say hi to every person with their camera on, but it would take too long. But I do see Masha Beshlin, hi, and Kati Vidlak and Bronwyn Bjorkman and Hong Chin Wu and other of our family, Eva Kovac and Jonathan in Vienna and other people, Anya Suravegina and all sorts of other people. Thank you. And I only do that with people who have their camera on. So that's supposed to be the reward you get. A couple of quick announcements. We have events of some kind or another every Saturday, as you know. Next week, it will be a very different kind of day. It's decoloniality and food with two scholars from South Africa. It should be fascinating. Please join. Then on December 2nd, I believe, it's two talks about cave painting and human language, which should be also fascinating. That's also Linguistic Frontiers. And there are various other events. You can find announcements of them on the website. And thank you all for coming. The format for today will be not like a sporting event at all. I mean, when there are two participants, you could think of it as a sporting event, but it is not. In fact, the only similarity between it and a sporting event is that we will flip a coin to determine the order of presentation. Okay, other than that, it is not like a sporting event. For example, there will be no winners and losers. There will be no rankings afterwards. There are no standings and so on. We're going to have two short talks. And they, each of them will be followed by 5 to 10 minutes of questions and answers and discussion on that talk. And then if there's time at the end, we'll just continue that into a general discussion. Okay. I would now just like to introduce our presenters. So we have, I suppose I should flip a coin first and then do the introductions. So here we go. So I guess we'll consider Susi the visitor, and the visitor always gets to call the coin toss in the air. That's still arbitrary, but so it's heads or tails. Are you ready? Okay, you ready? Here we go.
I want the one with the number. I don't know whether that's heads or tails.
Well, here, I'll show you. This is heads. It's actually George Washington, which is really kind of embarrassing. And tails looks like that.
I'm gonna go for tail. Tails.
Okay, tails it is. Tails it is. So Susi will go first. And I'm delighted to introduce Susi Wurmbrand from the University of Vienna and Harvard University. And that is the extent of my introduction. And the other speaker is Norvin Richards from MIT. So take it away, Susi.
Okay. All good? People see the slides and hear me? Okay, great. So I'm gonna start with what I call the hard questions about class structure. And those are the questions I won't be solving, but those are questions that I'm interested in. Namely, what parts of class structure, if any, are universal? If there is a universal set of categories or features or meanings that make up class structure. And I think those are very hard to answer unless one has ways of, hold on a second, my picture, ways of approaching the question of what class structure looks like within languages and across languages. And what I will be offering here is some evidence that I consider interesting and promising for how to determine class structure and the order of projections. And those will be containment, implicational hierarchies, and truncation, and the various combinations thereof. Okay, so starting with the basic clause structure, if we abstract from various details, there is fairly broad agreement that there is 3 types of clausal domains. So either if you look at like extended verbal projections with various labels, you have a selection there. There is sort of a CP domain, a TP domain, and a VP domain. Groman has unified this as prolific domains. He has defined them via specific functions. So an operator domain, that's his omega domain, a bar properties, the phi domain with all sorts of a properties, and then the theta domain with argument structure. And the third approach that I will actually be using here is an approach proposed by Wurmbrand and Svenonius. And what they suggest is that, again, there's 3 domains, clausal domains, but they correspond to semantic or conceptual sorts, event, situation, and proposition. And what I find interesting in this approach, and here again, if you're concerned about some of the details, that specific details they're using in their paper, I think that's not the main message here. The message is simply that the broad clausal domains can be defined in a containment configuration, which makes various predictions. But so roughly speaking, events involve the argument structure, various sub-events like resultativity, actionsart, etc. Situations include elaborations of events. And you see this in my graphic here, that a situation includes an event. It's building on an event, it elaborates an event by adding time and world parameters. And lastly, propositions include elaborations of situations, and via transitivity, we get the inclusiveness relation here. Propositions include situations and situations include events. And that follows from sort of the way clause structure has to be built to get to certain results. So if you're happy with an event, then all you need to do is construct an event. If you want a proposition that has a truth value, etc., then you need to build this up in this and only this order. Myself and co-authors, so most importantly Magdalena Lohninger, but also in later works with Eva Kovac, we have applied this to complementation. And when you look at the typological and theoretical works, there is some kind of agreement, namely that there are different types of complements and they are more or less dependent, transparent, integrated into or with from the matrix clause. So at least broadly, the typological and theoretical works converge, and we have summarized this in an overview article. We get a hierarchy like this. So this now refers to the complement clauses that can denote a proposition, a situation, or an event. And depending on that, the events are the most dependent ones, and the propositions are the least dependent ones. So there's this kind of scale. Via containment, this can be accounted for. But before I say how this works, here is just an illustration. I'm using transparency effects in German here. So we have a claim or belief complements, they refer to propositions, and then decide complement situations and try complements events. And when you try to cross the complement boundary via something like scrambling, that is possible with situations and events. So she has a frog decided or tried to kiss. But when you have a proposition complement, then this kind of scrambling is not possible. So this is just one transparency property where different complements are more or less transparent. And it's always the way, and this is sort of the summary from these works in an abstract way. When we look at the 3 types of complements, transparency is most likely with events and least likely with propositions. And most importantly, there's an implicational hierarchy that whenever a particular category, so say a situation, is transparent for various properties, events are as well. And what's not attested cross-linguistically is the opposite. So for instance, a situation transparent and an event not being transparent. So you see this hierarchy here, one can make it more detailed. And it's not just necessary to account for, like I put here, Romance transparency or restructuring and Germanic ones. It's also necessary to account why there is this hierarchy and to exclude why there are no languages of this kind. And containment and truncation can do that. So since propositions contain a situation and an event, they are necessarily the most complex. And it doesn't really matter whether we look here syntax, semantics. We believe it's a combination thereof, but just the containment basically gives us different complexities. Therefore, propositions are the most difficult to establish dependencies across because it's the largest distance, you have to cross the biggest things, etc. And certain operations like scrambling in German or flitty climbing, it's the most famous one, they require less complex complements, and that can be done via truncation. But truncation is dependent on the causal hierarchy in the sense that a situation may lack the higher propositional domain because a situation is a situation, and once it's a situation, it's happy, right? It doesn't need to grow all the way up. And an event complement would be happy in principle with just the event domain and doesn't have to go bigger. So proposition complements, on the other hand, they can't just lack, at least not the entire highest domain, because then they wouldn't be propositions. Then the meaning would change and something would go wrong. Okay, so that's part one. Now, once we turn to the finer grained structure, there are two questions. Can the detailed structures of the broad causal domains also be defined via containment? And second, should they be defined via containment? And there will be two answers for that. One answer is, well, maybe. And what we need to know for that is whether the structures and the containment relations are stable across languages. And then obviously they should be defined via containment because it will predict the structure. No, for structures that can vary across or within languages. And what I will talk about here is the event domain. I will just summarize some basic literature where people have suggested some containment configurations. I am not sure that the situation domain, so that's the entire TMA domain, whether that can be defined via containment. And for the proposition domain, which I will be talking about most here, there are some containment configurations that I think are very interesting. Okay, so when we turn to events, that's the argument structure domain. The decomposition of verbs that has been suggested, Helen Kaiser, Katzo, and then many more, is what you sort of see here. So the idea is that a voice head combines with something that has a result in it, for instance, at least in certain cases. So I opened the door. I am the agent of a causing event such that that event results in the door being open. And that structure has necessary containment configurations, at least for certain types of predicates. And we can actually diagnose this with various modifiers. So for instance, again, has two interpretations depending on where it would adjoin. Now, there's also the truncation effect, which when you take off the highest layer, so the voice layer where the agent is introduced, you do get predictable syntax and semantics. The syntax would be unaccusativity because there is no agent anymore. And the semantics would be no semantic agentivity, Utah effects, etc. So this would be the door opened, the agent is gone, and we cannot use something like deliberately. And it gets then more interesting when we look at passive and other cases, but that's sort of the idea about containment and truncation taking place in that domain. As I said, for the situation domain, I am not sure that there are really properties that are stable across languages because people are not even agreeing on whether all of the projections are there. So there's a big debate whether there are languages that lack tense altogether. If a language has tense and aspect, it's usually ordered in the way that tense is higher than aspect. But all other things seem to be variable, although certain languages may have a strict ordering, but cross-linguistically, it's much harder to come up with fixed ordering. And in particular, containment seems to be very difficult to define for various aspectual elements. Here's just an example from German where you have the perfect auxiliary and the modal, and you can order them in either way. She has, eat must, so she had the obligation to eat, or she must have eaten, where must takes scope over the modal. So both orders are possible, hence there shouldn't be any cartographic mapping here. Okay, now turning to the CP domain, which is, as I said, I want to spend most of the time on. I got into this because I was trying to understand ECM, in fact. In order to understand ECM, I needed to understand the CP. And the more I sort of got involved in this, the less I felt I understood. So I'm starting with different types of CP cartographies. This is the original VC version. Maybe there's something in addition there, an int P, but I'm keeping it sort of easy here. Forest, topic, focus, topic, fin, and then the IP. There is certainly no containment relations here. So the only case perhaps that can be made is for the topic comment mapping, because the comment cannot include the topic, but otherwise wise force including a topic, wise topic including a fin, there's nothing in any of the definitions of these elements that gives us containment. There is a different type of cartography, the cinque hierarchy, and I've here only marked the elements that would belong to the CP domain, most likely in red. The cinque hierarchy is, of course, for the entire causal domain, but if we concentrate on the upper part, we get things like speech act, evaluative, evidential, epistemic. Those are semantic notions, but they are not defined in a containment configuration. So it's not necessarily the case for cinque that a speech act has to include an evaluative. So in that sense, no containment, it's just an order of elements that are semantically defined, and it's not clear whether they should involve any containment relations. Krivka, and that's the last version the almost last version I'm using here, suggests another kind of cartography in the sense that there is a fixed mapping between syntax and semantics. And he has three projections here that are defined semantically. So propositions for him are the TP, those would be situations for Ramchan, same idea as before. Judgment phrases express a private judgment about a proposition. So a JP makes a judge parameter available, and that then gives us evidentials, epistemic, in terms of adverbs, things like probably. Then higher up, there is a commitment phrase, and that expresses a public commitment to a judgment. And you see already here that there is a containment relation here. In order to have a commitment, you need to have a judgment. Some examples are given here. And lastly, there's a speech act phrase that expresses the common ground updates, and it identifies the judge with the speaker typically. But of course, in embeddings, things could change. Now, what's interesting here is that Cinque's and Krivka's semantic hierarchies are actually similar, except in the details and the motivation and the names. But there's one crucial difference, and that's why I think it's interesting, namely that Krivka's hierarchy is defined by a containment. And a speech act phrase is built on a commitment phrase, and the commitment phrase is built on a judgment phrase. It can only be structured in that way. And he argues that those are syntactic projections because they show effects in syntax as well. So here we are now at a question. Are the semantic hierarchies separate from Rietz's more syntactic hierarchy? Are they part of different domains of grammar, or are they interwoven in some way? And here the hypothesis that I'm suggesting here The syntactic General Sherman, I'll tell you later what General Sherman is, combines syntactic and semantic properties. The projections defined via containment yield rigid orders, and the idea is ideally universally rigid orders. But other projections, they may be ordered rigidly or flexibly, and to determine that, I think it's still largely an empirical issue. I'll show you some ideas about the CP, but to really come to a conclusion about this, one needs to look at languages cross-linguistically, obviously, and not just one language. Okay. So how to do that? I will now again employ implicational hierarchies and truncation. And the idea here is that if syntactic projections, even when they are not in a semantic containment relation, if they show implicational hierarchy effects, then we can make certain conclusions about syntactic order. And I'll give you examples so it will be less abstract in just a second. The tool to use that will be truncation. And the idea is that if X is missing, then all higher elements are necessarily missing as well. This is abstract. Now we are going to get to some data. So towards General Sherman, this is now borrowed from work by Denis Satik. And what he suggests is already a mixed semantic and syntactic left periphery. He has two C layers, the higher one and the lower one, a topic phrase, WH focus. His is a bit more complex, so I'm simplifying it here. And then he includes a propositional layer. And the propositional layer can correspond to Krivker's COMP and JP. And then there is the TP. Now, his main goal in this paper was to actually show that infinitives are necessarily smaller than finite clauses. So there is some obligatory, maybe exfoliation, similar to Pesetsky, but also different, that the highest layer here, CP2, the red one, is necessarily missing in infinitives. Infinitives can also involve further truncation, but no infinitive can ever have CP2. Now, the nice thing about this kind of approach is that it now allows us to make predictions and implicational statements. And there's one that's out in the literature from Joachim Sabel, namely the WH infinitive generalization. If a language has WH movement to spec CP, so in the left periphery, then this language has the option of filling the C system of this type of infinitive with an overt complementizer. So this is the infinitival complementizer. You can have 4 in English or D in Italian. And the ordering here makes the clear prediction that infinitival complementizers do not entail WH infinitives. That's exactly Sabel's one-way generalization. But WH infinitives entail infinitival complementizers. Not in an obligatory way that whenever you have a WH infinitive, you have a complementizer, just the structure is there in principle, and depending on distributional properties of the complementizer, it can then be there, but we expect to find it in at least some infinitival constructions. Whereas if a language has a complementizer, it doesn't mean that it necessarily has the higher projection. So that's truncation, right? Truncation tells you whatever you cut off is gone. Whatever you leave, everything below is there as well. Okay, there is one language that we discovered that may not work well yet, but so far it looks like at least something promising. In general, talking about infinitives, the value of this approach is that it also covers the language variation, or it predicts that there is language variation in a systematic way regarding the size of infinitives. And we're only looking now at the CP domain, so not like the traditional restructuring one. So for instance, Italian has a very large size. It can have topics in infinitives. To him seems the carpet to have it venduto. This clitic here tells us it's topic. It also allows focus. It allows WH infinitives. Him, I told where to go. It has a complementizer. Here you see the D, and it allows propositional infinitives, for which I have no example here. English does not allow topics, so there's sort of a minimal difference to Italian. I decided your book to read is bad in English, but of course WH infinitives are fine, and infinitival complementizer is fine. Here you have an example of propositional infinitives. I claimed to be the queen of Catan, so that projection needs to be there as well. Then we have Icelandic and Swedish. They have complementizers. In Swedish, it actually seems to move there, but it can target this position, but no WH infinitives. So again, this is predicted, a language that has a complementizer, but no WH infinitive. And that's the case. And they also have propositional infinitives. German does have propositional infinitives, but no complementizer. So this projection would be gone in German. It's just propositional phrases. You have seen an example before, and those are the ones that are not just like TPs. They have to be larger because they prevent transparency properties. And then there's Turkish and Hindi. This is all still from Denise, that are bare TPs. And what's interesting here is that in those languages, there are no propositional infinitives. Whenever you have a claim, belief, complement, it has to be obligatorily finite. So infinitives cannot include the prop P, which means there can't be propositional infinitives. But, so here's a big but. Slavic languages do not fit or not fully fit into this pattern. In particular, propositional infinitives are impossible throughout Slavic, but higher projections, for instance, WH infinitives, are possible with then different cutoff points again. So for instance, German does not have propositional infinitives, but has WH infinitives. That has propositional infinitives, but no WH infinitives. Slavic has WH infinitives, but no propositional infinitives. So there is no hierarchy between these two properties. Now, when we ask the more general question again, the ordering of prop P with respect to the other CP properties, so take making a proposition out of something, compared to topic focused WH, there is no necessary containment relation. Prop P doesn't entail focus, or focus doesn't entail prop P. Focus is something on a different level, on a different plane. And so the question you may have asked already, well, why is the prop P all the way down there, right? Why isn't it higher up there? And the point is exactly that given that there is no universal implication or relation between WH infinitives and propositional infinitives, and we can make similar points for topic and focus and propositional infinitives, there should not be a fixed mapping. So the suggestion is that in the languages that I started with, the propositional phrases are low, but in Slavic, the propositional phrases are above topic P, and infinitives project maximally to topic P's. So an infinitive can have a topic in Slavic, can have a WH phrase, complementizers in some of them at least, but it can't be finite because the prop P only, the proposition is necessarily cut in infinitives. So you may now be at a point, well, does this now mean anything goes, right? And the answer is no. So certain orderings are rigid, and we have seen some of them. There is still a fixed order, and unfortunately I cannot show this in detail, but what I've now done here, I've given the Krivka propositional phrases and here the information structure phrases in different colors, and we find fixed order among the same colored projections. So topic taking a comment, and the speech act, com, JP are ordered rigidly in that way. But between the different colors here, there is no necessary ordering. Yes, so, and the important point here is still that the decomposed syntactic structure of prop P, which is the only one where I've told you there is clear variation across languages, is observable in syntactic properties such as indexative. And in my latest work, I've applied it to an ECM hierarchy in Germanic, where we find differences in exactly the order here. So universally flexible orders still make predictions as well. So even if propy is high up in some languages and low in other languages, it still then makes implicational predictions, namely that when it's high, then whenever you have a propositional infinitive, you should have topic phrases, topic options focused as well. But when it's low, then not necessarily. So the hierarchy is still there in a way, but certain points are flexible, and then one needs to sort of look at the points where the implicational relations may arise. So General Sherman, here it is. It's the currently largest tree on Earth, 84 meters. And what I talked about is this part, right? Just the CP part. And the take-home messages are, it is highly unlikely, and I think actually both empirically and theoretically, that there's a fine-grained fixed universal clause structure, such as gene quest, for instance. General Sherman combines syntactic and semantic clause structure elements, and I only gave the CP here. Evidence for structure and order of projection. So you may have the feeling now we have very little to hold on to, and I don't think there is one. We just need to look, use the right tools to sort of ask the right questions. A question is there a universal hierarchy? Is gonna be no, but that doesn't mean that we don't still have super exciting things to talk about in syntax. One just needs to employ the right tests here. And containment, truncation, and implicational hierarchies seem to be what tells us about rigid orders cross-linguistically, about orders within languages, etc. And the main idea is that if there is no semantic containment relations and no universal implicational hierarchies, then ordering may be variable within or across languages. Hierarchies, when they are really found in all languages, so if the WH ordering can be maintained, then we would want to sort of say that this is sort of a universal syntactic hierarchy. But if things can be swapped around, then this is just how it is. And this needs to be said once, I think. And it's also not a bad thing. I think there's variety, there's diversity in syntax, and that's not bad, right? Diversity is good in general. And we want to sort of not sweep things under the rug, but use our tools to bring out what the real cool things are. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to suggest that we have 2 questions maximum right now, and then to be sure that we move on to the next one, then we'll have time for at least 2 questions there also, and then we'll go from there. So if anyone would like to make a comment or a question right now, please raise your electronic, little yellow electronic hand. And we have one, Ziv in Tel Aviv, please.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. That was a really thought-provoking talk.
Thank you.
If you could go back to slide 22, please.
I will do. Can you see it?
Yeah, okay. So you're saying that there can be flexibility in certain functional heads, right, in the left periphery, and they can appear in different heights between different projections. So do you see any morphological evidence in any languages where the same morpheme, the same propositional morpheme could appear in different areas?
Oh, so the idea is that each language chooses only one place. That's
okay,
the
because at the end you said either between or within languages.
Yes,
so I wasn't sure if, okay.
Yeah. So
cool.
there may be more
much.
positions. I don't have evidence for that yet, but these 2 orderings that propositions are higher than topic or lower than C1, those are tested, but each language has only one position, I suppose.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that wasn't clear.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ziv. Do we have another hand?
Tommaso.
We do. Tommaso, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Unfortunately, I don't know why, but I cannot turn on my camera. It doesn't work. My question connects with this one. I was wondering, so if you think that we can expect in acquisition that children might, in a first stage, early stage, posit the two positions as both being possible, and then, let's say, fixed their parameter, or let's say, yeah, acquire the correct one further later on.
Yeah, possibly, I guess. So, I mean, I don't really know. In languages where it's up there, maybe you would expect the children first acquire infinitable complementizers and those kind of things. But you meant if it's really truly flexible in universal grammar, then both should be available to the children, and they should show some signs of that. Possibly, I'm just sort of thinking of what you would need to test this, right? The children would need to have complementation already. They would need to know what a propositional complement is. They would need to know the difference between infinitives and finite clauses, because the ordering really only shows up in infinitives, because propositional complements are possible in all languages. It's just propositional infinitives that are restricted. And I honestly have no idea how the path of acquisition works for all of these phenomena. I imagine it's complex, but in principle, yes, you are right. There should be certain predictions.
All right, thank you very much.
As promised, we will now move on, although we should have time at the end for additional questions for Susi. So first of all, Susi, thank you so much. It's fantastic and fascinating. The slides are available in the chat, and we'll also be posting them on the website, and everyone will be encouraged to continue to have a dialogue about it. Before I introduce our next speaker, I would like to use this platform to congratulate a member of the NYI staff on her, on this. Someone who has been with us for, technically I should have been more ready for this, but it's okay. Okay, so instead of there we go. Okay. So I'm trying to do this. It's not going as well as I anticipated. That's okay. Was I sharing something that I shouldn't have been then? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Just trying to find the thing. This is what it was supposed to be. There it is. So sorry about whatever you might have seen before, but that's Lena Zimtsova's little boy who was born a couple of days ago. Lena has been with NYI. Many children have been born to faculty and staff of NYI over the years, and this is just the most recent edition. So there it is. So thank you very much. Congratulations. And now I will introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Norvin Richards from MIT. Take it away, Norvin.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Susi, for that wonderful talk. I am deeply humbled to be here in this big room full of people. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. I have, and congratulations on the staff member on an excellent baby. Thanks for sharing that with us, John. Let's see now. I have just shared my handout in the chat, and now if I can figure out how, I will share it on the screen. There it is. So I'm nowhere near as organized as Susi and never have been. So instead of slides, what I have is a handout, which I'll walk you through. So this is a talk about the sound of trees. Here we go. there's a classic set of assumptions by lots of people, Zwicky and Pullum and lots of other work, that hold that syntax is supposed to be blind to phonology. And this is sort of built into our standardly assumed architectures for the derivation. So we assume a derivation in which there is a syntactic computation operating on a representation that has no phonological facts. Phonological facts are supposed to be introduced after the syntax is over. Contiguity theory is this theory that I and some others have been playing with for the last little while, of which the central claim is that this is not true. It's almost true. So the access that the syntax has to phonology is quite limited. But there are cases, we've been arguing, in which syntax gets to access phonology, and in which the best explanations of why syntax does what it does have to do with syntax having access to phonological representations. Now, here's the first of many places where, because I'm talking for 20 minutes, I'm going to leave all kinds of interesting questions wide open. So, you know, the classic assumption that syntax is phonology blind has architectural consequences. We have a T model or a spell out model where syntax feeds PF. If contiguity theory is right, that's not the model that we want. Raising the question, what model do we want? And I just won't talk about that question at all until somebody makes me. The case studies that I'm going to offer you today, sorry, I'm getting the chat in a place where I can see it. The case studies that I want to show you today involve first the EPP. So I'm going to review an existing contiguity theoretic account of the distribution of EPP effects. And then I'm going to talk about two phenomena that I've just started working on, the head final filter and AP adjacency, and I'll explain what those are. Certain heads are standardly described as requiring specifiers. So English T, for example, requires a specifier. That's the classic EPP. English interrogative C requires a specifier. That's WH movement. So we say that certain kinds of heads like English T and English interrogative C have to be preceded by certain kinds of phrases. But there are these other kinds of heads that have a stricter requirement, and they're kind of going to be the center of what I want to talk to you about today. The phrase preceding them has to end in its head. So there can be a phrase before it, and you can tell that it's a phrase, but the last thing in that phrase has to be the head of the phrase. One of the examples of this is the head final filter. So English nouns can be modified by adjectives. You can say a proud woman. English adjectives can have complements. You can say things like she is proud of her daughter. But English adjectives which are modifying nouns cannot have complements. You can't say a proud of her daughter woman, or a dissatisfied with the service customer, or a tough to solve completely problem. Yeah. So English N can be preceded by an adjective phrase, but that adjective phrase has to end with the adjective. These are English data. This is a pretty widespread phenomenon, though there are also languages that don't have it, and I'll be talking about that in a second. So that's one of the kinds of cases I'm going to try to cover. Second kind of case has gone by various names. Sometimes it's called AP adjacency. This is an observation about languages in which adjectives and nominal complements both follow the noun. So languages like Hawaiian and Hebrew and Scots Gaelic, in which you, in Hawaiian, say, if you want to say the big picture, you say the picture big, so the adjective goes after the noun. If you want to say the picture of the tree, you say, well, the picture of the tree, noun complements go after the noun. But if you want to say the big picture of the tree, you must put the adjective next to the noun. You have to say the picture big of the tree. You can't say the picture of the tree big. Yeah, this is a fact about all of these languages, apparently. So the literature on this stuff makes it sound like this is a universal fact about languages with these word orders. That's kind of a surprising fact if you have sort of Radford era assumptions about where various things in the noun phrase ought to be. Yeah. So, you know, one way to say this is the nominal projection that precedes the adjective has to end in the noun. You can't have a complement that goes before the adjective. So, some questions. What's the difference between heads like English T and C, which can be preceded by phrases that don't end in their heads, versus heads like English N and Hawaiian A, which can be preceded by phrasal material, but that stuff has to end in its head? What's the difference between those things? Or maybe equivalently, what's the difference between the specifiers of TP and CP in English EPP and WH movement cases, which don't have to end in their heads, and phrases like English adjective phrases and Hawaiian noun phrases, which just if they are preceding certain kinds of heads, have to end with their heads. Also, I alluded to this before. Why are there exceptions? So the head final filter is pretty widespread, but there are plenty of languages out there that do not have the head final filter. I'm sorry, what was that? Oh, okay. There are some languages out there that are reported to allow violations of the head final filter. There are some examples in 6. So there are languages like Greek, for example, and Bulgarian. There's actually supposed to be a split in the Slavic languages between languages that allow head final filter violations and languages that ban head final filter violations. And this looks like an excellent room in which to test that theory. So I'm going to be interested to hear from people about what their favorite languages do. So here's the roadmap for what I'm going to do for the next little while. I'm going to set up an account involving contiguity theory. It's going to explain why some kinds of phrases don't have to end with their heads. And then it's going to explain why some other kinds of phrases do, like in the head final filter case and in the AP adjacency case. And then we're going to try to explain the exceptions, things like the 1s and 6. So in order to set this up, I need to show you some of the bare bones of how contiguity theory works. It's going to be important in what goes forward to assume that DP and PP are spell-out domains. So that's going to turn out to be why, in the good cases, the thing in first position, the English subject or the WH phrase, is something like a DP or a PP. That's going to be why it's allowed to not end in its head. The bad phrases are going to involve phrases other than this. So the material that needs to end in its head is something smaller than DP. So in other words, the reason that the head final filter and the AP adjacency cases behave as they do, because the crucial phrases are smaller than DP, they're not protected by spell out from the reasoning that I'm about to run through. Okay. So contiguity theory. Contiguity theory has 2 main claims about requirements that are imposed on the interaction between syntax and phonology, which can cause the syntax to perform syntactic operations like movement. So 2 main claims about those requirements, and then 1 claim about how those requirements are allowed to interact with each other. So the 2 requirements are affix support and contiguity, and then there's this sort of traffic rule called multitasking. Affix support is a requirement on heads which do not introduce stress beats. So heads which don't introduce stress beats need to have a potential host that does introduce a stress beat. And if they are affixes, they need that host to be in the direction of affixation. This is connected to work by people like Lisa Selkirk and Adam Worley on clitics, this idea that the construction of the prosodic representation for the sentence involves taking things that that cannot themselves host stress and attaching them to things that can in order to create a well-formed prosodic structure. That's the account in this story of the classic EPP. So why in English does TP need a specifier? Well, English TP needs a specifier because English T is a suffix and it doesn't introduce a stress beat of its own. So it needs to be preceded, because it's a suffix, by something which does. And that's why the subject moves into the specifier of TP. We end up with an account of the distribution of this kind of classic EPP effect. So English and French have the EPP, Spanish and Italian and Greek, for example, don't. But we don't just have to specify that. We don't say some languages have EPP features and others don't, or whatever. We can derive that from things that we get to understand about the rules for placement of stress in the verb, and also for the morphology of the verb more generally. So in a language like French, stress is final in the word or maybe in the phrase. Anyway, there are no morphemes in 9a that introduce stress beats of their own. And that means that the suffixes need to be preceded by phrases. That's why French has the EPP. Spanish, on the other hand, there's lots of work on Spanish stress that argues that Spanish stress gets assigned to the position before the tense morpheme. So the tense morpheme is introducing a stress of its own, which is getting realized on the syllable before it. That means it doesn't need this kind of support. It's already got a stress that it's carrying with it. And then there are languages like Greek in which tense is not a suffix at all. It's languages of the 9a kind that have EPP effects. Languages of the 9b and c kind do not. I'll direct you to Richards 2016 if you want to see this theory tested against a large sample of languages. Okay, so upshot of all that is we should not posit EPP features. There shouldn't be diacritic features on heads saying, hey, this head needs to have a specifier. There's this condition of affix support, and it is met in different ways in different languages for reasons having to do with independently observable facts about morphology and phonology. Condition number 2 is called contiguity. It says that if you have a selection or an agree relation between two things, X and Y, there can't be anything between X and Y that is more prosodically prominent than Y, the thing which is being selected or agreed with. What's prosodic prominence? So two cases that are going to be of interest to us. First, A is more prominent than B if A is a phrase and B is a head. So phrases are more prominent than heads. And second, if the two things are both phrases or if they're both heads, then there are parameters. Prominence shows up on either the leftmost or on the rightmost thing. That varies from language to language. And it varies from language to language in ways that we can independently investigate by studying the prosody of the languages in question in ways that I won't try to go into here for reasons of time, but I'm happy to talk about if people would like. So for example, if we run the relevant experiments for English, we can determine that English is a language in which prominence tends to go on the leftmost phrase. And that gets a bunch of classic facts about the distribution of adverbs in English clauses. So, you know, if you have a sentence like Mary has solved the problem, you have agree relations between T and Mary and between little v and the problem. Those agree relations both impose this contiguity requirement between the heads and the phrases. But those contiguity requirements have different effects in the two cases. So if you consider the relation between T and Mary, like in 12b, the only requirement is that Mary be more prominent than anything that's between Mary and T. And because English realizes prominence on the leftmost phrase, Mary will be more prominent than probably in 12b. And so contiguity is satisfied in 12b. On the other hand, and for the same reason, you cannot say Mary has solved quickly the problem, so 12c is bad, because English realizes prominence on the leftmost phrase, and so quickly will be more prominent than the problem, and you need the problem to be more prominent than quickly for contiguity to hold. This is, people sometimes say the direct object has to be adjacent to the verb in English, and then they admit that that's not quite true. So there are certain kinds of particles that can intervene between verbs and objects in English, and that's because the particles are small in this story. They're just heads, so they're not more prominent than the objects. That's why you can say Mary has found out the answer, and it's why you cannot modify those particles with an adverb. So Mary has found right out the answer. This is out. This is kind of a puzzle on classic stories about why the verb and the object need to be adjacent to each other in English. It's not about needing to be syntactically close. It's about needing to not be separated by any phrases. Lots and lots of other things follow, but that's the basic mechanics of contiguity. And then there is this kind of traffic rule I said called multitasking. What it says basically is if you can do two things at once, then you should. Yeah, so if you're choosing between two operations, A and B, and the conditions satisfied by A are a superset of the conditions satisfied by B, then you should choose A. Yeah. And that has the upshot, for example, that if you have a head that has both contiguity needs and affix support needs, a head like English T, let's say, it's best for it to satisfy both of those with a single operation, like moving the subject to the specifier of TP. That's why it's specifically the subject that gives T affix support. So T in English needs affix support, and it also needs to be contiguous with the subject. So the subject is the thing that you should move to the specifier of TP. Is the basic story. And now here is the new proposal. If multitasking forces a head to seek contiguity and affix support from the same thing, the same X, it's going to seek contiguity with every projection of X that's still in the workspace. That's the core idea. Question might be why? Ask me that question later. Let's see what that idea does. Why do some phrases not need to end with their heads? Well, consider first the case of English EPP. If DP is a spell-out domain, by hypothesis it is, then at the point in the derivation in 14, the only part of DP that's still in the workspace is the DP itself, not the D. And that means that T needs to be contiguous with DP, and it can be even if there are adverbs in between. We ran through that, but it doesn't need to be contiguous with D. Let's imagine what our lives would be like if DP were not a spell-out domain. Well, then contiguity with T would fail. This is 14 prime. So the T would need to be contiguous with DP, and it is, but also with D and it's not. So there's an NP linearly intervening between D and T. And NP is a phrase, and D is a head, and phrases are always more prominent than heads. So 14 prime would be bad if DP were not a spell-out domain. That's going to be the core of the story about the other cases, the head final filter and the AP adjacency case. So why do some phrases need to end with their heads? Let's start with the simplifying assumption that all languages are Tagalog, which seems like a reasonable assumption. So all languages have a property that Tagalog and some other languages have, that adjective phrases, when they modify nouns, need to be combined with a particular type of functional head. In the Tagalog literature, it's called the linker, so I'll just call it that. The linker linearly intervenes between the adjective and the noun. So in Tagalog, you can put adjectives either before or after nouns, and the linker just has to be in between them. So there are two ways to say a big goat. They're there in 15. The linker leans to its left, so it is a velar nasal if that's phonotactically possible, and otherwise it's a freestanding morpheme na. And I'll posit trees like the ones in 16 for this, so there'll be a linker P dominating the adjective phrase, and that'll be the adjunct adjoining to the noun. Now, this linker is selecting the adjective phrase, and it is agreeing with the noun. So Tagalog doesn't have any agreement between the linker and the noun, but there are lots of Kurdish languages in which you do get agreement. There's a Zazaki example in 17, where the linker that intervenes between goat and big indicates something about the 5 features of the goat. So it's feminine singular. So thanks to multitasking, it's seeking support from something on its left. And thanks to multitasking, that means it'll have to create contiguity with the thing on its left, which will be either an adjective phrase, if the adjective phrase is first, or the noun phrase, if the noun phrase is first. All right, that's going to get us the head final filter. So you can say a very dissatisfied customer, English has a linker, it's null there in 18a. It needs to be contiguous both with very dissatisfied, the AP, and also with the A, dissatisfied, and it is, because it's adjacent to it. On the other hand, a very dissatisfied with the service customer, no good, because that linker needs to attach to the adjective, because it's the adjective that it's in a selection relation with, and it can't get next to it because it can only lean to its left. That's the head final filter. Why are there exceptions to the head final filter? Well, we'll come back to them. Now we can do AP adjacency. Why in Hawaiian does big need to come between picture and of the tree? Well, you can sort of see what the story is now. The linker, which in Hawaiian, as in many languages, is null, needs to lean to its left on something that it's in a selection or an agree relation with. In this case, it needs to lean on the noun picture, and it can't do that in 19b. We need 19c. So we solved the problem in 19c by extraposing the noun complement, apparently to someplace quite high. So it follows post-nominal demonstratives. It's quite high in the noun phrase. Now, so now we can do the exceptions. So the structure in 20 was the kind of structure that I was showing you. In the case of the head final filter, for example, we said that XP is a noun phrase, the YP is a linker phrase, and the ZP is an adjective phrase. And there was a story there about why the linker needed to be adjacent to the adjective. You couldn't say proud of his daughter man. You could only say a proud man. The story was it needs to have a host to its left. Thanks to the combined effects of contiguity, affect support, and multitasking, that thing needs to be the head. And if there's a phrase intervening between them, the result is bad. That's 22. This account started with the assumption that the linker could only lean to its left and couldn't undergo any interesting movements. Yeah. Suppose there were linkers for which that assumption was false. So there are some languages that are reported to allow head final filter violations. I've given you Bulgarian and Greek and Polish examples in 23. Yeah. What's special about these languages? Well, here's a generalization, which as far as I know has no exceptions. I'll be really interested to hear if people in the room know of exceptions. It goes like this. It's a generalization about languages that have pronominal clitics. So if a language has pronominal clitics, and those pronominal clitics can take NP internal material as a cliticization target, where I'm trying to be careful about this, it's not just that they accidentally end up attached to a noun phrase, but they, the best statement of where they are cliticizing is I am trying to cliticize to something inside the noun phrase. In languages like that, you don't get the effects of the head final filter. So those are languages like Bulgarian and Macedonian and Polish and Greek, and I'll show you examples. If a language has pronominal clitics that can't take NP internal material as a cliticization target, then the language must obey the head final filter. This is languages like Czech and Slovak and Serbian and Croatian and Italian and Spanish and Slovenian, lots of languages. So for example, consider Bulgarian clitics. Bulgarian clitics can criticize inside the noun phrase. If you want to say your book, your is a clitic, it attaches to book. If you say your many new books, your is still a clitic, and now it's attaching to many. So it's attaching to the first thing in the noun phrase. Yeah. Same is apparently true of Polish clitics. Not the same, they don't behave like Bulgarian clitics, but they are like Bulgarian clitics in being able to have hosts that are inside the noun phrase. So my helping him on Tuesdays, there's an example there in 26. Polish and Bulgarian are both languages that can violate the head final filter. They're examples in 27. So you can say, very proud of his child father in Bulgarian, or a rich and experienced human being in Polish. Yeah. On the other hand, languages like Serbian and Italian cannot have clitics inside noun phrase, apparently. So there's a Serbian example in 28. So the introduction of him to Maria, you need to use a freestanding pronoun. You can't use a clitic. And similar data in Italian in 29. And these are the kinds of languages that obey the head final filter. These are languages that are like English and not allowing a phrase to intervene between the adjective and the noun. So in the theory developed here, we could look at this as indicating something about the behavior of the null linker in these languages. So I've been talking as though the linker always just leans to its left. But languages like Bulgarian and Polish apparently have something special about them. They allow cliticization to adjectives. You can tell by looking at their clitics. Their clitics are attaching to adjectives. And apparently what we're learning is that in a language like that, the null linker has the ability to satisfy contiguity by moving past the adjectival complement and attaching to the adjective. So Polish is a language, or Bulgarian is a language, in which if you start with a rich and experienced man, this null linker has the option of acting like the pronominal clitics and moving to the position that it needs to be in. In a language that can't attach clitics to adjectives, well, then that movement is ruled out and you get the head final filter. On this view, it's possible at least that there aren't any real counterexamples to the generalization that the linker that intervenes between adjectives and nouns needs to attach to the adjective. The apparent counterexamples come from the fact that there are languages that have less strict requirements on the behavior of that linker that give it the possibility to move a little bit in order to get where it needs to go. Sadly, for reasons of time, I can't talk about a really important question. This has all been about languages that have pronominal clitics. What about languages that don't have pronominal clitics? Feel free to ask me about that. Let me stop. So the story that I developed on independent grounds to deal with the EPP in languages like English, if you tweak it very slightly, you can use it to deal with the head final filter and with the AP adjacency generalization. The relevant tweak made use of the idea that the phrase satisfying EPP is a DP, which shields its internal structure from the kinds of conditions that I've been talking about. The phrases involved in the head final filter and AP adjacency are smaller than that. And that means that the requirements of contiguity are stricter in those cases in ways that we've now explored. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Norvin. In being consistent with our first talk, we'll have a couple of questions just for you, and then we'll see what anyone else would like to talk about after that. So let's see, I do see Ziv, who asked a question of the first talk. So
Ziv is extremely consistent. Yes, it's great.
Yes, sorry. But we also want to see anyone else who would like to raise their hands to make sure that everyone gets a chance. But in their absence, 2 seconds have gone by. Ziv, take it away.
Yeah, sorry, I keep pestering you, but I'll keep it focused. So this account for AP adjacency makes a really specific typological prediction, right? You can have right prominent and left prominent languages, each with a left-leaning or right-leaning filter. Does the typology pan out in this case?
So actually you're right, but in ways that I want to be sneaky about. I've been talking as though linkers always lean to the left. And and I'm not trying to tie that to the position of prominence. So I'm just talking as though these linkers always lean to the left. You're raising a really good question, though. Could there be languages in which linkers want to lean to the right? Could there be languages where linkers are just freestanding morphemes and don't need to lean on anything at all, right? Those are certainly live possibilities. All of the languages I've talked about have been languages in which linkers lean to the left. And to answer your question, it doesn't have anything to do with the position of prominence. These linkers are always leaning to the left. So question, why are these linkers always leaning to the left?
I'd say that in Hebrew they might go right, by the way.
Sorry, say it again.
I'd say that in Hebrew they might go right, but maybe we can talk about that more later.
Oh, well, I'd like to hear more about that, yes. The languages that I have been talking about in Hebrew might be really relevant for this are mostly languages that go in for suffixing in a big way, right? And so one possibility, at least, is that if you are a child attempting to learn the morphological properties of a phonologically null thing, your best guess is that it's like most of the morphemes that you can see, that is, that it's leaning to the left. But so that raises the really interesting question of whether if we look at languages that are isolating or primarily prefixing, are we going to see these kinds of effects? And I don't know yet whether that's true or not.
All right, cool, thanks.
Sure.
I'll pester you by mail for more
Please
questions,
do.
I guess.
Please do.
Bronwyn.
Hi,
Sure.
Bronwyn.
Thanks for the talk. I always like hearing about contiguity theory.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question. I think I missed something about what the requirements of the linker are.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is when the linker, so let's imagine that we're thinking about Tagalog.
Yeah.
So we can see the linker. If it's before the noun, it wants to be adjacent to the adjective and lean on the adjective so that it can satisfy its affix support and its contiguity at the same time.
Yep.
But when it's after the noun, why does it now want to be contiguous
with the noun?
Why does it seem to have different contiguity needs?
Yep. So the core story was contiguity relations are with things that you select and also with things that you agree with.
Sure.
And we are taking the Kurdish data really seriously. That makes it look as though the linker is agreeing with the noun. It has 5 features that seem to come from the noun. But I was claiming it is selecting the adjective phrase. So it has 2 things that it would like to be contiguous with, the adjective phrase and the noun phrase. And it wants to lean to its left. So the reasoning that I went through involving multitasking involves saying, yeah, if it's going to lean to its left, it wants to lean to its left on something that it's in a contiguity relation with. And that could be something it selects, like the adjective phrase, or it could be something that it's agreeing with, like the noun phrase. It wants contiguity with the other thing too, but this sort of souped up condition that it needs to be contiguous not only with the phrase, but also with the head. This is specific to the thing that it's also getting support from. So that I don't know if I'm clarifying it at all, but that's the story. It's trying to be contiguous with both of these things, but it wants to be contiguous with the head just for the thing that's to its left, because that's where it's leaning.
Okay, then maybe if I can just ask a quick follow-up question. Why are post-nominal adjective phrases allowed to have specifiers or degree modifiers?
That's a really good question. Tagalog is sadly the wrong language to look at, but you are probably thinking about languages like, say, Italian or French or whatever, right?
I mean, I was actually thinking of English if we think that what you do with an adjective that has a complement is put it after the noun.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So you're right. So we could think about English. We could also think about languages like Italian or Spanish or whatever languages that always have adjectives after nouns. Because English is extraposing those adjective phrases, it's possible that those adjective phrases are being moved somehow out of harm's way, maybe to a higher position.
Sure.
You're raising a really good question, which I would want to connect to another really good question that I was afraid somebody would ask me, which is what happens when there are multiple adjectives?
That was the other question, yes.
Yeah, so, and I think a possible answer to that would be, well, what we're learning is that there is a lot of concord inside the projection of the noun, such that if you are adjective number 2, you want to be contiguous with, I've talked as though you want to be contiguous with the noun, but maybe the adjective that's immediately before you also has the 5 features of the noun, which might or not be realized morphologically, and that makes it a pretty good target for contiguity as well. Whether that will help me with your problem, I'm not sure, because it's a serious problem. But I would attempt to extend that to talk about your kind of case. It's interesting to think about.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And now we transition seamlessly to continuation, just with no restrictions on who you ask or what you talk about. Adam.
I'm going to have 2 questions, one for Norvin and one for Susi. So if that's okay. It's quick questions. For Norvin, the question is, so linkers are pronominal clitics. Are there linkers which are in other phrases, which are verbal clitics and other stuff? Or that's the question to Norvin. The question for Susi is, the phrases which have fixed order in the sort of left periphery, let's say, right? And some of them are more free relative to each other. Have you thought about, is this reducible to anything? Like, you know, we've discussed in our seminar that cartography, there's a paper by Abels, can be reduced to some sort of restrictions on movement, for instance, or relativized minimality. Could be that the lumping of things which have to be fixed vis-a-vis each other and the lumping of things which can be free vis-a-vis each other is somehow connected to the features that these things encode. I hope I'm being specific enough and clear enough. Thanks.
Susi, do you want to go first or second, or do we need John to flip the coin again? Okay, so mine can be real fast. You wanted to know whether there are linkers on adverbs as well. There are 2 reasons to think that there are. One is that Tagalog uses linkers on certain adverbs, though not all of them. So it actually uses the same morpheme that it uses for adjectives and nouns, for manner adverbs, for example, though not for temporal adverbs. And another reason to be happy about that is that there are things that look an awful lot like the head final filter in the domain of adverbs. This is stuff that Bayer, for example, has written about. So you can say, she has quickly solved the problem, but you cannot say, she has more quickly than I have solved the problem. So if quickly is followed by a phrase, it's bad. And we might want that to be the same kind of effect. Over to you, Susi.
All right, thanks for the question. Short answer, I don't know. It's sort of a technical way of getting certain restrictions on how high something can go, right? That's what you're suggesting, that there is a freezing position or there is a halting position. So one sense, I haven't worked this through, obviously, but one sense I have is that, sure, you can probably derive everything with that. But the real challenge that I see is to derive to not derive what you don't want to get, right? So to derive the implication of restrictions or the things that are not available. And so that I don't know. I have my doubts, but I also, as I said, I haven't played through that. The way that may be possible is to really have some kind of feature hierarchy that may allow you to do that. But then there's still the question, where is the feature hierarchy coming from? And we're basically probably back to the same situation. But it would be fun if someone works this out, because then one could maybe get to places where we say, well, this is where we really make different predictions. And I, as I said, I suspect it's in excluding the impossible that these kind of approaches may struggle with.
Thank you. Anybody with a little electronic or human hand? Well, I have a human hand, and I also have the microphone. So before we go to Ziv, Norvin, I would like to ask you a very short question. Other longer ones, I would say, for some other forum. But so just globally speaking, would it then not be expected to ever be the case that a traditional EPP effect so-called, would be satisfied by a null element. So there's no large pro satisfies the EPP or Spanish pro, little pro satisfies the EPP, etc. That is never going to be a thing.
So, yeah, sorry.
No. That I think I said enough.
Yeah. That's a really good question. Of course, I would like English large pro to have to satisfy the EPP. I think we have good reasons to think that it moves to higher positions and all kinds of binding data and stuff like that teach us that. So I think this is one of those places where I get to take advantage of the fact that although I have the syntax making reference to phonology, it's only making reference to a sort of a very rough draft of phonology. It knows about some kinds of things, which things are prefixes and which things are suffixes and where stress goes, but it might be a little bit unclear on which things are null. I think that's what I would want to have to say, that pro, the fact that big pro is null is a fact that gets established at some point in the derivation. And what your kind of case teaches us is that it gets established after the syntax for does its best. I have a picture of the syntax where the syntax is doing its best to solve all kinds of complicated problems, but it's just not very smart, and so it takes this thing that turns out to be phonologically null and puts it in a position where it's supposed to support something, and oh well, it did its best. That's the picture that I would want to offer.
I won't ask a follow-up question with my other hat on, where I want to give as many people a chance as possible. Anybody make another comment or question? We will post these slides for both talks on our website and encourage continued discussion, but we can still have a few more minutes of questions, including Ziv. It's okay. Go ahead.
Thanks again. Sorry for the pestering, but Susi, I have two questions that may be related. Relative clauses, do you assume that they follow the same hierarchy? And relevant to that, do you want to assume anything about the nominal domain or the KP, the DP, the NP, anything along those lines that is similar, has a similar containment structure?
So relative clauses, I don't have all the data. They seem similar to WH infinitives. Remember that to really make claims about the different sizes, you need to basically look at infinitives or complementation configurations, and complementation won't work for relative clauses. So infinitives, I am not sure if WH infinitives and infinitival relatives show exactly the same distribution. Overall, yes. So the languages we mentioned today have either both or neither, but I can't now remember, but I think there were some reasons to assume that it's not totally the same. So the question would then be, what do relative clauses target? So in Rizzi's structure, I think he also has differences between finite and non-finite ones, which may also entail that relative clauses may actually have two options, but it's a little unclear to me yet. It would be actually interesting to see if there are differences, because it may tell us something about where relative operators go. So the default would be the same, they pattern with wherever WH operators go. But then I think there's some differences in terms of the Italian left periphery, what you can have before and after, which is why there may be multiple positions for relative operators. Other question was, yes, so you asked whether I would want to, so it's whether I would want to extend this to the nominal domain. Of course I would want to. I think it's like what we want to do, right? We want to understand why the nominal domain also has a rigid structure. So like the Cinque and Abels and Neleman universal number I forgot, but that certain orders are possible, and that there's sort of a rigid ordering of demonstratives and determiners and who knows what. Yes, definitely. I don't know whether it's necessary semantically to have any containment configurations. So what's interesting is that the nominal domain in certain approaches shows really a great similarity to the verbal domain. There's sort of a debate of whether DP corresponds to CP or to the IP. Both have good reasons for it. But if we take it semantically, then there's sort of a very nice parallel. You have the thematic domain, NP, little np, etc., with the arguments. Then you have an inflectional domain with like a 5 phrase, and that can be split in various ways, number phrases, gender, etc. And then you have what I think semantically corresponds more to the operator domain, because in particular for definiteness, specificity, quantificational elements, deixis, in particular deixis, that relates sort of the property of the noun to the world, at least in some cases, right? And in that sense, there may be some containment formulations possible, but when I sort of look at the semantics people give to determiners, quantifiers, and nouns, I don't see any sort of obvious containment relations. On the other hand, the thematic, inflectional, and discourse-related structure, I think looks like it clearly has an implication of hierarchy at least, whether it's defined via semantic containment or not. And one area where this actually just came to me now, where this already exists, is the structure of pronouns, right? If you look at the Jen and Wilch code, they have different types of pronouns, which effectively are truncation structures. So you have pronouns that are not deictic, but they could still have some definiteness and certainly inflection. And they discuss language variation and variation within languages. So clitics have less structure than strong pronouns. So deictic pronouns, strong pronouns, weak pronouns, clitics is sort of a hierarchy that people have suggested. And that seems to clearly follow an implicational hierarchy, that if you have certain projections that are high up, you also have the ones that are lower down there, but you can truncate the structure of pronominal elements at various places and you get different elements. So that looks like exactly the kind of things I'm talking about. The only thing I'm not certain is the semantic containment, but implicational hierarchies and truncation seem to be existing already, and at least in the realm of pronouns, and maybe interesting to include other nominal projections as well.
Would you want to wrap up reflexivity in pronouns as well under that umbrella, or do you want to relegate that elsewhere?
Reflexivity is in the sense that reflexive elements are heavily underspecified and they need a dependency with another element. So there's a syntactic dependency that has to come in, right? Some form of binding or a feature transfer, however you do that. So what I would put in there, for instance, is Kratzer-style minimal pronouns, which have nothing in yet already, but then they become, they can become any type of pronoun, presumably. So I don't know, I'm not sure how to sort of, so they're part of a hierarchy in that they're fully underspecified, but then they do become, they do become possibly even referential, right? Depending on what the binder is. So there's 2 levels, I guess that's the way to say it. There's 2 levels at which reflexivity comes in. At the initial level, yes, they are missing everything, but they may have slots or underspecified heads. And then at the final level, I think they are just whatever the pronouns are that we have already.
Cool, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We technically whatever that means, have 2 minutes left. There's actually no technical sense in which that's true. So let me remove the adverb and just say, we have 2 minutes left. And that would allow a final comment or question. And since I don't see anything, I would just like to encourage you all to continue this dialogue in the NYI Commons, where we will also have a thread that will start with the two handouts if our speakers don't object. And people can dialogue there. Let us just thank Norvin and Susi so much for doing this at this time of day, wherever you are. And thank you all for coming. It's great to see everyone. Please come again.
Thanks so much for coming, everybody. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you, John, for inviting us to do this.
Yes, same for me, of course. Yep. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all so much. It was good to see you.
Bye. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.